Hello and welcome back to Mound Books for another author interview. My name's William and I'm the manager here. Now, the interview you're about to watch was recorded earlier on when I interviewed Cameron Fraser on his latest book, Missionary Baptism Evangelical Unity. Now, Cameron lives in Alberta, Canada, so he can't be with us in person, but he did join us on Zoom, so please watch this and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Cameron, it's very good to have you with us. I'm glad that you could be here.
Well, thank you. It's very good of you to have me.
Oh, no problem at all. I want to begin straight away just by asking you to introduce yourself. Tell the people at home a bit more about yourself, who you are, what you do.
Okay, well, to begin at the beginning, I was born in what's now Zimbabwe in southern Africa, just north of South Africa. My dad died when I was just 4.5. So my mother and my two older sisters and I moved back to Scotland, and we settled in Dingwall, just north of Inverness in the Highlands, and that's where I grew up. My mom died when I was 6, so we moved in with my mom's oldest sister and her husband, who was a noted minister in the Free Presbyterian Church, so he was a big influence growing up. Also, in 1967, the Banner of Truth published my dad's biography, James Fraser, the Man Who Loved the People. So, although my memories of him are limited, I had that and my sister's recollections when I wrote my own account of his life and influence a few years ago. It was my first published book. When my uncle retired, we moved to Inverness, and I was already at that time attending Edinburgh University, and after that I crossed the ocean to the United States to attend Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. When I was there, I was working, doing some writing for the Westminster Bulletin, as it was called then, doing reports and guest lectures and faculty interviews and such. And as a result of that, I was asked in my senior year by the then president of the seminary, Edmund Clowney, to edit a magazine called The Presbyterian Guardian, which was founded by Gresham Machen, the founder of Westminster, and was closely associated with the seminary. I did that for 2 years while working in a further degree, and I sometimes say that my career started at the top and it's been going downhill ever since. I also met and married my wife at Westminster. At one time, I had hoped to go back to Zimbabwe to work with another uncle in literature ministry, which is where my interest was, but he and his family had to leave the country during a civil war, leave everything behind, so that door closed. The next plan was to move back to Scotland to work with Blytheswood and Christian Focus, which had been founded by Jackie Ross. Christian Focus was founded a few years after Blytheswood. This was before the Mackenzies took it over and built it up into what it is today, something I could never have done. So we were looking into shipping costs and planning our move when I got a phone call from Jackie asking me to stay where I was and start a North American branch of Blytheswood. Nothing too much came of that. I'm not really an organizer. But through a series of circumstances, I ended up managing a Christian bookshop in Vancouver, Canada, British Columbia, Canada. And through that, I met some young people, ex-hippies who had been converted a few years earlier and had been influenced partly by our store in a reformed direction. And they were trying to start a church further up the coast. So they invited me to preach for them once a month and once a week. And then they called me to be their organizing pastor, and we moved up there. Lived on the beautiful Sunshine Coast for 12 years, and then took a call to a Christian Reformed church in Alberta, which is the next province over, across the Rockies, moving from the coast to the prairie. It was in some ways like moving back into the 50s. Generations of farming families living together, working together, worshiping together, not unlike what I'd experienced growing up in the Highlands as an FP, although the CRC is not as conservative. In fact, it's become quite mixed of late. So I was in that pastorate for 9.5 years, and then took another one in Lethbridge, Alberta, where I am now, for 9 years. And then I had some other roles in the denomination as well, but about 15 years ago, I had a rare form of cancer. So a few years after that, I took early retirement and concentrated on writing, which is something I'd always wanted to do along with preaching. Let me just add that we have 2 sons, 2 daughters-in-law, 6 granddaughters, all girls, 3 of each. My sons are Canadian born, but they're very proud of their Scottish heritage. They both wore kilts at their weddings, something I didn't do, but I am wearing my Scotland football jersey, which was a gift from one of my sons. I coached both of my sons in soccer, which is what we call football here. And I think you can see over my shoulder the map of the clan map of old Scotland.
Yeah.
I'm a Canadian citizen. I've lived in Canada most of my life, but I'll always be a Highland Scot at heart.
I know quite a few people who would resonate with that sentiment. Well, thank you for telling us a bit about yourself. But turning then to your latest book, why baptism? Out of the plethora of biblical doctrines and topics that you could have written about, why did you decide to write about baptism?
Well, there's more than one question there. First, as you say, it's my latest book. It's not my only one. Baptism isn't the only subject I've written on. One of my first books was Developments in Biblical Counseling. I've written what I'd call biographical essays in book form on my dad and my uncle and Lord Mackay, as well as co-authoring a book that was partly about my experience with cancer and mostly about a girl in my church at that time who had a rare blood condition. I've contributed chapters on different subjects to other books. And I've just completed a book manuscript on evangelicals and abortion. So I've written on a fairly wide range of topics. But why baptism? Well, it's certainly central to the definition in Ephesians of one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And it's a subject that's interested me since my teens, which is quite a while ago.
Okay, and just a slight follow-on question to that then. Is a common understanding on this sacrament more important for you than other issues in terms of unity?
Well, as I say, it's central to the biblical definition. And so, yes, I think it is.
Okay. Well, you mentioned at the outset of your book that the material of this comes from several essays and articles that you've written over a number of years. So I assume then that baptism and its effects on evangelical unity has been a particular burden for you for a number of years. Why is this so?
Well, it's been an interest of mine ever since my teens, which is a long time ago. But the articles that formed the basis of the book weren't actually written over a number of years. I wrote 2 in 2020 for the Scottish Bulletin of Evangelical Theology on William Cunningham's view of baptism and its implications. But your question reminds me that a little over 20 years ago, I wrote a research paper on Richard Baxter on baptism and conversion. This was part of a Doctor of Ministry program. I was working with Dr. Packer at the time. And before that, some 40 years ago, I wrote my THM thesis on parachurch organizations and the church. Parachurch organizations exist because Christians can put aside their secondary differences and work on a common mission, common goal. And my thesis was and is that that's because the church has failed to exhibit the unity that it should and that Christ prayed for. I was happy to discover sometime later that the late Martin Lloyd-Jones said much the same thing. And I quote him at the beginning of the book on baptism and unity and why we shouldn't divide over that issue.
Could you not say, though, that achieving some form of unity between Presbyterian churches, for example, which have the same doctrinal beliefs of, well, at least the practice of infant baptism anyway, is an easier way to begin this process of gaining evangelical unity, rather than perhaps getting Baptists or congregationals or other independent churches to perhaps compromise even on their biblical view of baptism?
Spoken like a true Baptist.
Yeah.
I'm not so much asking Baptists to compromise as I'm suggesting that a view of infant baptism, such as I argue for, which I've heard called critically baby dedication with water, is compatible with evangelical churches who baptize infants. Dedicate infants. I realize Reformed Baptists generally don't, and that's why I speak of evangelical unity more generally than simply Reformed.
Okay.
But speaking of Presbyterian and Reformed folk in general, I think one of the things I'm attempting, although I recognize it's a forlorn hope, is to come to some consensus on the meaning of baptism and its implications for the status of the children of believers and how we train them and bring them up. And there's a wide range of views on that.
So, well, with that question in mind, then, is there a specific audience that you had in mind when you wrote the book? Is it aimed for pastors, seminary students, general church members, or is it perhaps directed more towards particular denominations? So, for example, you put a great emphasis on rejecting Kuyper's view of presumptive regeneration. So is this book just a pushback against people who hold that view? You know, who's the book written for?
Well, it's probably directed more at pastors and seminary students than the general Christian church membership. One reviewer suggests that it would be a good introduction for seminary students on the various views in baptism, not just two, but various. I'm not aware of any seminary doing that, but yes, my criticisms of presumptive regeneration are directed at my current denominational affiliation. Presumptive regeneration is not any longer the official position of the CRC, but the influence lingers. And one result of that is that some people, not all by any means, but some who were baptized as infants and then later have a conversion experience, decide that their infant baptism was a meaningless ritual and they reject it. I'm trying to give them a different understanding of that. Also, others grow up assuming that they're born again, even if there's not a lot of evidence. And that's really my greater concern.
So you call your book Missionary Baptism, but there doesn't appear to be much distinction between that missionary baptism and the examples of household baptism that we have throughout the New Testament, for example, Acts 16. So why call it specifically missionary baptism and not just simply household baptism?
Well, household baptisms generally take place in missionary or evangelistic situations. William Cunningham makes the point that if we Paedo-Baptists were used to seeing more baptisms taking place on the mission field, we would have a better understanding of the fact that what he calls adult baptism or believer's baptism is in fact a New Testament norm, and infant baptism is a modification of that. It's also been called converts baptism, and in the nature of the case, adult converts, especially heads of households, bring their families into the church by baptism. So that's why I called it missionary baptism. It also harks back to my missionary background. The cover of the book is a picture of the Victoria Falls, which symbolizes both the waters of baptism and my missionary background in Zimbabwe.
Okay, well, so thanks for clarifying that for us. You base your arguments for achieving evangelical unity through baptism by leaning heavily, as you just mentioned, on William Cunningham's view. Now, he mentions that in the New Testament, infant baptism was rather the exception than the rule, and it was adult baptism that was in fact the normal practice. So why do you think that this view has been dismissed amongst Reformed churches, perhaps even in particular amongst those of a Presbyterian background?
It's generally agreed that the Reformed view, which Cunningham did agree with up to a point, goes back to Zwingli at the time of the Reformation in response to the Anabaptist rejection of infant baptism as it had been practiced prior to the Reformation. Zwingli tried to put it on a more sound theological footing. And as that was further developed by Calvin and then the covenant theologians in the 17th century, the focus increasingly became on the status of baptized children. Are they regenerate? Are they presumed to be regenerate? Are they covenant children? So on. I'm suggesting that those are the wrong questions to be asking. Cunningham wasn't the only one who held the view that he did. Others in Scotland did, including John MacLeod, who was one time principal of the Free Church College as it was then, author of Scottish Theology. But it's been generally rejected by most Paedo-Baptists in Scotland and elsewhere. So to answer your question, I think it's because the focus is too much on the status of the child rather than on the meaning of baptism.
That's a helpful summary. Well, thank you for that. Now, this is maybe a bit more of a sort of almost a summary of your whole book, this question. But if you were able to get some of the leading figures in Baptist, Presbyterian, and congregational independent churches together in one room, is there a particular sentence or paragraph that you would like to say to them to convince them to come to some form of consensus on baptism and achieving evangelical unity?
Well, going back to what I just said, that the heart of the Reformed view is the circumcision baptism analogy of Colossians 2, 11 and 12, circumcision in the Old Testament, baptism in the New. Reformed Baptists, as distinct from Baptists in general, accept that that's a legitimate analogy, but they would argue, as I would, that in the heightened spirituality of the New Covenant, it refers not to those who are born, but to those who are born again, who are circumcised in heart, who are the true children of Abraham. Mm-hmm. So I tried to find some consensus on that, but then also in the fact that God works through families and the implications of that for how we view our baptized children. I might add that there's a review by the editor of Reformation Today, which is a Reformed Baptist publication, in which he attempts very seriously to interact with these questions. There's another by an Australian Reformed Baptist who actually attends an evangelical Anglican church, and he published his review in a Presbyterian magazine. So those are the kinds of conversations I was hoping to generate.
Okay. Well, that's a great answer. Thank you once again. Just as we're drawing our interview to a conclusion, it's gone quickly. But one final question for you. Did you find it a joy or a challenge to write about such an important subject?
Well, both, but mostly a joy, especially after I discovered that Cunningham confirmed what I'd always thought. The challenge is to convince fellow Beta Baptists of his position. Baptists who are aware of it are naturally more sympathetic, but I think he didn't go far enough. The real challenge has been distribution. There have been a number of very positive reviews in both academic journals and popular publications on 3 continents, but they haven't necessarily translated into a lot of sales. If you're Prince Harry, you can sell 1.4 million copies in the first day, depending on the subject, of course. But not many of us can do that. But the word is getting out, and I very much appreciate what you're doing at Mound Books, even if, and especially if you don't agree. So thank you very much.
Oh, no problem at all. Well, we always do our bit to try and put solid Reformed books out there and to make them as easily available and as economically available as possible as well. Well, thank you very much, Cameron, for taking your time to join us for this little interview. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for joining us for this latest author interview. And I was joined earlier on today by Cameron Fraser when we discussed his latest book, Missionary Baptism and Evangelical Unity. We have plenty of copies of his book in stock. They're normally £13, but we have them a special discount for you for £9.50. And remember, as always at Mound Books, if you buy £15 worth or more of orders, you get your postage to the UK for free. So please do join us again for our next author interview. We have a few lined up for you this year, so pay attention to our YouTube channel and also on our Facebook and Instagram accounts, and you can follow us for all the latest news there. Thank you once again.